A simple cup of coffee for a homeless man turned into $1 million secret. I never thought I'd still be working at the same supermarket I started at back in high school. But here I am, 10 years later, wearing the same dull-colored polo shirt with a name tag that's seen better days. Not exactly where I thought I'd be by now, but life has a way of pulling you into its own plans while you're busy making yours. My name's Mike, 32, single, and stuck in a job that pays just enough to keep me from drowning, but never enough to swim. I manage a medium-sized supermarket in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. You know the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and Friday night entertainment means either a high school football game or grabbing a six-pack from the gas station and sitting on your front porch. It's not terrible, but it's not exactly inspiring either. My days are predictable. I unlock the store at 6 a.m., deal with deliveries, keep the cashiers from quitting over coupon-crazy customers, and break up occasional arguments in aisle 6 over the last box of discounted cereal. If I had $1 for every time someone tried to use an expired coupon from 1998, I wouldn't still be working here. But hey, at least it keeps things interesting. By the time I clock out, my brain feels like a melted TV dinner, and all I want to do is collapse on my couch and scroll mindlessly through job listings that I never actually apply for. I didn't plan on staying here forever. After college, I thought I'd land something better, maybe in marketing or business management, something where I'd wear a real suit instead of a company-issued vest. But the economy wasn't great when I graduated, and I needed money fast, so I took the only job I could get. 1 year turned into 2, then 5, and now, well, I try not to think about it too much. It's like quicksand. The harder you struggle, the deeper you sink. And let's be real, some nights, microwaving a frozen pizza and binge-watching reruns of old sitcoms feels like a small victory. The apartment I rent isn't much. A small one-bedroom with old carpet and a kitchen that looks like it hasn't been updated since the 90s. The fridge hums louder than my neighbor's TV, and the hot water is a gamble every morning. Sometimes I think my landlord is running a social experiment to see how much neglect a tenant can take before losing their mind. But the rent is cheap. Well, cheap for 2024, and it's home for now. My social life? Let's just say my most consistent relationships are with the regulars at the store. There's Old Man Jenkins, who buys a single can of soup every day like it's some sort of ritual. I swear, I think he's stockpiling them for the apocalypse. Mrs. Carmichael, who insists on telling me about her grandson's latest achievements, even though I've never met the kid. Apparently, he's the next Einstein or something. And then there's Derek, my only real friend, who works in the stockroom and has been here almost as long as I have. We joke about running away to California and opening a taco stand, but we both know we'll probably be here forever. Derek is one of the few people who keeps me sane in this place. We have a system. Every time a customer does something ridiculous, we mentally add it to our imaginary retail hall of fame. Like the lady who tried to return a watermelon because it was too watery, or the guy who insisted that the buy one, get one free deal meant he should get 2 for free. It's the little things that keep us going. I try to do some good when I can. There's a local charity that collects food for struggling families, and I help organize donations when the store lets me. It's one of the few things that makes me feel like I'm actually making a difference. Some of these families barely scrape by, and seeing their faces light up when they get a decent meal makes the long hours a little more bearable. Plus, it helps me ignore the fact that my own financial situation isn't much better. There's a kind of irony in managing a store full of food while stressing over whether I can afford groceries at the end of the month. Lately, though, I've been feeling stuck. Like I'm on a treadmill, moving but going nowhere. I want more, a better job, a nicer place, maybe even someone to share it all with. But every time I try to figure out how to change things, I get overwhelmed. The bills, the responsibilities, the fear of failing, it's all paralyzing. It's easier to keep going through the motions than to risk crashing and burning. Then, one night, something happens that changes everything, and I never see it coming. By the time my shift ended that night, the parking lot was nearly empty, except for a few scattered cars on the flickering streetlights. The air had that sharp, biting cold that sneaks through every layer of clothing, the kind that makes you wish you had a better coat. I pulled my jacket tighter and started toward my car. Just wanted to get home, warm up, and maybe pretend I wasn't going to be back here in less than 12 hours. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just another late-night shopper. Maybe someone looking for a forgotten ingredient or a quick snack. But then I noticed the way the security guard was waving his arms, his breath coming out in fast, angry puffs. A man in a tattered jacket stood by the side entrance, his shoulders hunched, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. He didn't look like he was causing trouble, just standing there, like he didn't have anywhere else to go. Security had other ideas. The guy, our night shift rent-a-cop, Bob, was already in full-on enforcer mode, pointing toward the sidewalk and making it clear that this man was not welcome. I recognized the guy, I'd seen him before, usually around the back of the store near the dumpsters, where we sometimes found old food donations waiting for pickup. He never bothered anyone, never asked for anything, just existed in that quiet, invisible way people like him tend to do. Bob didn't share my sympathy. He was still barking at the guy to leave, his voice echoing off the empty storefront. I wasn't in the mood for drama, but something about the way the man stood there, shivering in the cold, made me stop. I sighed. My body was screaming for a hot shower and a warm bed, but instead, I turned around and headed back inside. A few minutes later, I walked out with a cup of coffee, and the closest thing to comfort food I could find at that hour, a large pepperoni pizza from the frozen section, freshly microwaved in the break room. When I got back outside, Bob was still there, arms crossed, looking irritated that his big moment of power was being interrupted. I ignored him and walked up to the guy. I held out the coffee first. The man hesitated for a second before reaching out, his fingers shaking as he wrapped them around the cup. He brought it up to his face, letting the warmth sink in before taking a careful sip. The way he sighed afterward, like it was the first bit of heat he'd felt in days, told me I'd made the right choice. I handed him the pizza next. He looked at me for a long moment, like he was trying to figure out if there was a catch. When he finally took it, he held it close, not eating right away, just holding it like he was afraid it might disappear. Bob muttered something about company policy and walked off, leaving us standing there in the cold. We didn't talk right away. I wasn't sure what to say. I wasn't some hero, and I didn't do things like this often. But something about this guy made me want to stay. Maybe it was because I'd spent the last decade feeling like I was one bad break away from being in his position. Finally, he spoke. His voice was rough, like someone who didn't use it much. His name was Tony, and, as I'd soon find out, he had a story worth listening to. Tony didn't rush through his pizza the way I expected. He took his time, chewing carefully, like someone who had learned to make every bite count. The way he handled a cup of coffee, holding it close to his chest like a precious artifact, made me wonder just how long it had been since he'd had something warm. We stood there in the cold, neither of us in a hurry to move. I wasn't sure if it was pity or curiosity that kept me there, but something about Tony didn't fit the usual picture of a guy down on his luck. He wasn't muttering to himself or avoiding eye contact like some of the other folks I'd seen around the city. When he finally spoke again, his words were careful, deliberate, too deliberate. He thanked me, but not in the way most people would. He said something about how small acts of goodwill reinforce the social contract that holds civilization together. Who talks like that? Not the guys who usually camp out behind the store, that's for sure. I shrugged it off at first, chalking it up to just being well-read, or maybe one of those people who spent too much time in libraries. But as we kept talking, things got weirder. I asked how long he'd been out here. He gave me a vague answer, something about long enough to appreciate the asymmetry of economic stability. Again, what? I let it slide and asked what he did before this. He hesitated, then mentioned something about working in tech. That got my attention. Tech? Like what? Fixing computers. IT support? No. He started talking about cloud architecture, distributed databases, venture capital rounds. Half of it went over my head, but I caught enough to know this guy wasn't just another dude who got laid off from Best Buy. He was talking about stuff I'd only ever seen in those business magazines that sit unread in the break room. I pressed a little more. He gave me half answers, like someone trying to balance honesty with avoiding a full confession. He mentioned he used to run his own company. That's when the gears in my head really started turning. If that was true, then what the hell was he doing out here, eating pizza with some guy who barely scrapes by managing a supermarket? I knew better than to ask directly. Some people don't like talking about the past, and I wasn't about to push. But as we stood there, his words kept circling in my head. He wasn't slurring. He wasn't rambling. He was precise, like someone used to thinking 10 steps ahead. And yet, here he was, wearing a jacket that looked like it'd been through a war and standing outside my store in the middle of winter. Then, almost like he knew what I was thinking, he laughed. Not a forced, awkward laugh, just a quiet chuckle, like he was in on some joke I hadn't figured out yet. And that's when he dropped something that made my stomach tighten. He used to be rich. Not comfortable. Not did well for himself. Rich. The kind of rich that buys houses in cash and gets invited to those weird TED Talk after parties. So what the hell happened? That's when he mentioned the downfall. He didn't give me details, not yet, but he alluded to it, a series of unfortunate miscalculations. Family troubles. Some bad investments. It unraveled quickly, like a sweater with one loose thread. And just like that, he was here, standing in front of the supermarket, taking food from a guy who probably wouldn't have been able to afford his Wi-Fi bill back in the day. He shifted his weight, adjusting his grip on the coffee cup like he was buying time. I could tell there was more to the story, but he wasn't ready to give me the full version. Not yet. Instead, he steered the conversation towards safer ground, talking about how brutal the Ohio winters could be, how the city had changed over the years. I let him lead, but I was still piecing things together in my head. It didn't add up. Most people who hit rock bottom don't sound like they walked off the set of a Silicon Valley documentary. They don't casually drop terms like seed funding, equity dilution, or acquisition leverage. This guy knew things. Big things. Things I'd only ever heard people in expensive suits talk about on TV. And yet, here he was, standing in front of me, wearing 3 layers of mismatched clothing and clutching a styrofoam cup like it was his last possession. I told him if he ever needed another meal, he could find me here most nights. He nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something guarded, like he wasn't used to people offering anything without expecting something in return. He finished the pizza, wiped his hands on his jacket, and stood up a little straighter. For a brief second, he didn't look homeless. He looked like a man who had once made decisions that shaped industries. A man who had once been somebody. I wanted to ask more, to dig deeper, but I knew better. Some stories take time to come out. Some people need to decide if they trust you before they let you in. So I let it be. But Tony didn't walk away just yet. He looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, instead of saying goodnight, he sat back down on the curb, set his empty coffee cup beside him, and asked me a question. He wanted to know what I did for a living. The way he asked it, though, like he was trying to understand something deeper, made my skin prickle. I told him, supermarket manager, nothing glamorous. He nodded, thoughtful, like he was filing the information away. Then he said something that threw me off completely. Do you like it? Not in a casual, small talk way. He asked it like the answer actually mattered, like he already knew what I was going to say and was just waiting to see if I'd admit it. And just like that, I realized I wanted to keep talking. I wanted to know more. About him. About how he got here. And maybe about why I was still standing in the same place, years after I told myself I'd move on. I didn't know it then, but meeting Tony was about to change everything for me too. Tony sat there on the curb, still holding an empty coffee cup, like he was debating something with himself. I could see in his face the hesitation, the calculations running behind his eyes. Then he took a deep breath and said something that made me sit up straighter. He used to own domain names. Not just any domain names, valuable ones. The kind companies would pay ridiculous amounts of money for. Back in the early days of the internet, he'd bought up a handful of them when they were just sitting there, unclaimed, waiting for someone with foresight to snatch them up. I'd heard stories like this before. Some guy registers a domain for $20 in the 90s, forgets about it, and then one day, boom, Google or Apple or some megacorp wants it and offers him enough money to retire on. But Tony, he wasn't just telling me some recycled tech legend. He was saying it had actually happened to him. Or at least it might have. The problem was, he didn't know for sure. He had lost access to the email account tied to those domains years ago. He didn't remember the password. Didn't even know if the account still existed. He used to get offers. At least, he thought he did. Companies had reached out, but he'd ignored most of them back when life was good. Now, those emails were buried under years of digital dust, maybe lost forever. And if those domains were still active, if they hadn't been snatched up or expired, there was a real chance they could be worth a fortune. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This guy, sitting here in layers of secondhand clothing, could be sitting on a gold mine without even knowing it. It was like something out of a bad movie. But the way he spoke, the way his voice tightened when he talked about missed opportunities, made me believe him. I told him I could help. I had a laptop at home. We could try to recover his email, check if the domains were still his. Maybe it was nothing. But what if it wasn't? What if this was his shot at getting his life back on track? He looked at me like I just suggested we rob a bank together. Skeptical, wary, but underneath it, there was something else. Hope. The kind of hope people try to kill before it gets too big, before it turns into disappointment. Then I said something that threw him off completely. I asked where he was staying for the night. He blinked at me, clearly not expecting the question. Then he gave a small, humorless laugh and gestured around. Here, he said. There. Wherever. I told him he could crash at my place. Just for the night. A couch. A hot shower. Some actual rest before we tried this crazy idea of his. That's when he really looked at me, like he was trying to figure out what my angle was. Then he shook his head, smiling to himself like he'd just figured out the punchline to a joke no one else knew. You're weird, he said. You bring every homeless guy you meet back to your place? That made me laugh. And weirdly enough, it made me trust him more. The fact that he thought it was a terrible idea just made me even more sure he wasn't trying to pull something. I told him I wasn't in the habit of inviting random strangers home, but something about this felt different. If there was even a small chance that he was telling the truth, then why not at least try? Tony let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his face like he was weighing his options. He muttered something about how this was probably the dumbest thing he'd ever agreed to, then stood up, shaking his head like he couldn't believe he was actually doing this. I swear, if you've got plastic sheets on your furniture, I'm out. I rolled my eyes and told him my apartment wasn't that creepy. Barely. The walk back to my place wasn't long, but it was enough to give me a better look at Tony. Now that we were moving under proper streetlights, I could see just how much the streets had worn him down. His clothes were layered for warmth, but they were all the wrong sizes, like they'd been scavenged piece by piece. His shoes were falling apart, the soles barely holding on. But his posture, that was the thing. Even under all of that, he still carried himself like someone who used to be in control, someone who wasn't used to being ignored. When we reached my apartment building, I half expected him to back out, but he followed me in, eyeing the place with a look that was half amusement, half disbelief. Didn't peg you for a beige wall kind of guy, he muttered, looking around as I locked the door behind us. Yeah, well, the landlord has a strict no-personality policy. He smirked but didn't push it. Instead, he stood there for a second, just taking it in. Then, before I could say anything else, he pointed at my couch. That it? That's it. He nodded, dropped his worn-out backpack on the floor, and ran a hand through his messy hair. I was about to offer him the shower, but he beat me to it. Mind if I wash up first? I shook my head, told him to go ahead. He disappeared into the bathroom, and a minute later, I heard the shower turn on. I sat down at my laptop, opening up a browser, already thinking about how we were going to try and recover his email. This whole thing felt surreal. Less than an hour ago, I was closing up the store, ready to go home and forget about another wasted day. Now, I was sitting here trying to help a guy who might or might not be sitting on a digital fortune. Tony's words echoed in my head. The missed opportunities. The unfortunate miscalculations. The possibility that he had lost everything not because of bad luck, but because he just hadn't checked the right inbox at the right time. The shower turned off, and a few minutes later, Tony stepped out in clean clothes. Well, as clean as I could find from my own stash. He looked different. More like the guy I was starting to picture in my head. Someone who had been somebody. I told him to grab a seat. It was time to see if this crazy idea of his actually had legs. We sat down in front of the laptop. I pulled up the email provider's login page and looked over at him. All right, I said, let's see if we can bring your past back to life. He exhaled slowly, flexing his fingers like he was about to crack open a safe. We were about to find out if Tony had really lost everything, or if, just maybe, there was still a way back. The cursor blinked on the login screen. Waiting, Tony sat next to me, his fingers hovering over the keyboard like they were about to press the launch button on a rocket. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened just a little as he stared at the screen. It was past midnight now. The apartment was quiet except for the occasional hum of the fridge and the distant sound of a car passing outside. This was it, the moment of truth. Either this would be the start of something big, or we'd hit a dead end before we even got started. Tony exhaled slowly and started typing. His old email address. A password. He hit enter. Nothing. He frowned and tried again. Another password. Then another. Still nothing. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing the back of my neck. You sure about any of these? Tony let out a dry laugh. If I was, we wouldn't be sitting here guessing. Fair point. He tried a few more combinations. Each one met with the same rejection. After the fifth or sixth attempt, he let out a frustrated sigh and sat back, running a hand over his face. All right, so maybe I don't remember it. It's been years. I pulled the laptop closer and clicked the forgot password link. A new screen popped up asking for verification. Sent a reset link to the email associated with the account. Tony groaned. That email's dead. I haven't used it in forever. We checked anyway. He opened a browser and tried logging into his old email. Same problem, wrong password. He tried resetting that one too, but it wanted to send the link to a backup email he couldn't remember setting up. This was starting to feel like one of those escape room puzzles where every clue just led to another locked door. All right, let's try something else, I said. What about the domain registrar? Maybe we can go straight to them and reset it from there. Tony nodded, and we searched for the company. When we finally got to the login page, he typed in his credentials. And this time, something different happened. A red warning message flashed across the screen. Account access restricted due to outstanding balance. Please update payment information to proceed. Asterisk, asterisk. Tony cursed under his breath. That makes sense. I had everything auto-renewing on my old credit card. Guessing they locked me out when it stopped working. I clicked through the help section, looking for a way around it. Okay, so you just need to update the card, right? I paused. Wait, do you even still have that card? Tony let out a short laugh. That card's probably sitting in a landfill somewhere. And even if I did have it, it wouldn't help. That account's been dead for years. We sat in silence for a minute, both staring at the screen like we could will it into giving us a better answer. All right, I said, let's call customer support. Maybe there's another way. Tony shot me a look. Customer support? At 1 a.m? It's a big company. They might have 24-hour support. He didn't look convinced, but he let me check. Sure enough, they had an automated support chat. Not ideal, but better than nothing. I clicked the chat icon, and a little bot popped up asking for details. I typed in the problem, and after a few minutes of back and forth, it became clear what we already suspected. No payment, no access. And to update the payment, we needed access. A perfect little catch, 22. Then came the real problem. To reset the account, Tony needed to verify his identity. And for that, he needed a government-issued ID. I glanced over at him. You got an ID, right? Tony's expression darkened. Nope. I waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Like, at all. He shook his head. Lost it a long time ago. Never got around to replacing it. I exhaled sharply. That's not great. Yeah, no kidding. We both stared at the screen again, the weight of reality settling in. No ID meant no way to prove Tony was a rightful owner of the account. No way to reset anything. No way to check if those domains were even still his. I drummed my fingers against the desk, trying to think. All right, we're not out yet. There's got to be another way. What about old documents? Bank statements? Anything that ties you to the account? Tony shook his head. Everything was digital. No physical paperwork. And anything I got lost when everything fell apart. His voice trailed off, and for the first time, I saw it, the frustration. The exhaustion of someone who had spent years trying to climb back up, only to keep slipping further down. I could have let it go. Could have told him, hey man, we tried, and left it at that. But something about this whole thing felt unfinished. Like we were standing at the edge of something big, and I wasn't ready to walk away just yet. Okay, I said, straightening up. So, no ID, no paperwork. But that doesn't mean we're out of options. We just have to find another way to prove you're you. Tony gave me a skeptical look. And how do you suggest we do that? I grinned. We get creative. He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. And just like that, we were back in problem-solving mode. We didn't have a clear path forward, but we had something just as good, a reason to keep going, and maybe, just maybe, a way to pull Tony's past back into present. We just had to figure out how. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. If Tony had even the smallest shot at getting his life back, I wasn't going to let something as stupid as a missing ID stand in the way. So I did what any decent person would do. I decided to help him put himself back together, starting with the basics. First stop, clothes. Tony wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of a shopping trip, but I wasn't about to let him walk into a government office looking like he just crawled out of a dumpster. We hit a department store first thing in the morning. Nothing fancy, just a solid pair of jeans, a sweater, a jacket that actually had insulation, and a good pair of boots. Something practical. Something that made him look less like a guy who had spent the last few years living in survival mode. When he tried on the clothes, I barely recognized him. He looked normal, not a millionaire, not a guy about to buy a yacht, but just a regular person you pass on the street and not think twice about. That alone was an improvement. Next stop, a barbershop. Tony hadn't had a proper haircut in what looked like years. His hair was a mess, uneven and wild, and his beard was thick enough to make lumberjacks jealous. When the barber asked what we were going for, I just told him, make him look employable. Tony shot me a look, but didn't argue. 30 minutes later, the transformation was complete. Clean-shaven, fresh haircut, new clothes. He looked like someone who could walk into an office and not immediately get escorted out by security. He caught his reflection in the mirror and let out a low whistle. Damn, didn't realize how bad it was. I smirked. Yeah, you were about 2 weeks away from people mistaking you for a survivalist who just came out of the woods. Tony shook his head but laughed. And for the first time since I met him, I saw something different in his expression. Something like hope, with the basics handled. It was time for the real challenge, getting his documents back. The government office was about as painful as expected. A long line, bored employees who looked like they had given up on life, and paperwork that seemed designed to make people give up halfway through the process. Tony explained that he had lost all his identification and needed to start from scratch. The lady behind the counter barely looked up as she slid a clipboard toward him. Fill this out. Processing takes a few weeks. Tony sighed and got to work. I could tell it frustrated him. He wasn't the kind of guy who liked asking for help, much less going through bureaucratic nightmares just to prove he existed. Still, it was a step forward. A slow, painful step, but a step nonetheless. We were about to leave when it happened. Someone called Tony's name. Not, hey, buddy, or excuse me, but his actual name, Anthony Carter. We turned, and there he was, a guy in a sleek navy blue suit, well-groomed, polished shoes that probably cost more than my rent. He looked like he belonged in an office with a view, not standing in the middle of a government facility. Tony's entire body tensed. He recognized the guy, and from the look on his face, he wasn't happy about it. Tony, been a long time. Didn't think I'd run into you here. The guy smirked, like he had just won a bet no one else knew about. I looked between them, trying to piece things together. Tony didn't introduce me, didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he exhaled, his voice carefully neutral. Didn't think I'd see you again either. The guy chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. Yeah, well, I've been looking for you. Actually, a lot of people have. Seems like you disappeared off the grid for a while. I glanced at Tony, who clenched his jaw but stayed quiet. Whoever this guy was, he had history with Tony, and not the good kind. The guy turned his attention to me. You a friend of his? Something like that, I said, not liking the way he sized me up. He nodded like that was all he needed to know, then turned back to Tony. Look, I'll get to the point. We both know why I'm here. You've got something valuable. And let's be honest, you're not in the best position to hold on to it. I frowned, feeling my stomach tighten. What are you talking about? Tony exhaled slowly. He's talking about the domains. The guy's smirk widened. Bingo. See, I work for someone who's been very interested in getting those domains from you. And since you've been hard to find, let's just say we've been waiting for the right moment. Lucky for you, I'm here to make things easy. Tony's expression didn't change. Easy for who? The guy reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a sleek business card. I can make this simple. You hand over access to the domains, assuming you can get them back, and I'll make sure you walk away with a decent payday. I narrowed my eyes. How decent? He smiled, the kind of smile that made you want to check if your wallet was still in your pocket. Enough to get you back on your feet. I didn't like the way he phrased it. He wasn't offering Tony what the domains were actually worth. He was lowballing him, hoping Tony was desperate enough to take whatever scraps were thrown his way. Tony stared at the business card, silent. I could see the wheels turning in his head. The guy had him cornered, and he knew it. Look, the guy continued, you and I both know this is your best shot. You're homeless. No ID. No way to prove anything. Even if you do get access back, what are you going to do? You can't hold on to those domains forever. Sooner or later, someone else will find a way to claim them. Tony's fingers tightened around the edge of the clipboard he was holding. I stepped forward before he could speak. We'll think about it. The guy gave me an amused look, but didn't argue. He just handed Tony the business card. Don't take too long. This is a one-time offer. And just like that, he turned and walked out, leaving us standing there. Tony didn't move for a long time. Finally, he let out a slow breath, staring at the card like it might bite him. They've been waiting for me to show up, he muttered. They knew I'd have to resurface eventually. I crossed my arms. Yeah, and they think they've got you trapped. Tony nodded, then tucked the business card into his pocket. I had no idea what he was thinking, but I knew one thing for sure. He wasn't ready to give up just yet, and neither was I. We left the government office without saying much. Tony was still holding on to the business card like it might catch fire at any moment. I could tell his mind was racing, and honestly, so was mine. That guy, Ethan, hadn't shown up by accident. He had been looking for Tony. And the fact that he was so eager to get his hands on those domains meant one thing. They were worth a hell of a lot more than what he was offering. I figured we needed a minute to breathe, so I steered us toward a cafe down the street. A real hole-in-the-wall kind of place. Nothing fancy, just decent coffee and booze that hadn't been replaced since the 90s. It was the kind of place where no one asked questions, which was exactly what we needed. Tony barely looked at the menu. I ordered us both coffee and a couple of sandwiches. Figuring he hadn't had a proper meal in a while, he drummed his fingers against the table, staring off like he was trying to solve a problem in his head that refused to cooperate. Then, just as the waitress set down our drinks, I heard someone behind me let out a low whistle. Well, Anthony Carter. Thought you were dead. Tony tensed immediately. His fingers curled slightly around the edge of his coffee cup, but he didn't turn around right away. I shifted in my seat, getting a good look at the guy standing behind us. He was in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, dressed sharp but not corporate, dark jeans, a button-up, and that casual confidence of someone who had made it in life but didn't need to prove it. He had a thin layer of scruff, and his eyes had that sharpness you see in people who spend their lives thinking 5 steps ahead. Tony finally turned, his expression unreadable. Alex. Alex grinned. Man, you look different. His gaze flicked to me. And you got company. Didn't take you for the new best friends type. I didn't like him already. Something about his tone had just the right amount of smugness in it. Tony sighed, rubbing his temples. We really doing this right now? Alex pulled out a chair from the table next to us and sat down uninvited. I don't know, you tell me. Last time I saw you, you were telling me to go to hell. Now, here you are, drinking diner coffee and looking like you just crawled out of a redemption arc. I raised an eyebrow. You two know each other? Alex leaned back, smirking. You could say that. Used to work together. Built some stuff. Argued about a lot of things. Then one day, Tony decided he didn't need anyone and torched every bridge on his way out. Tony exhaled sharply. Yeah, well, I was wrong about a lot of things. Alex's smirk faded slightly. That's an understatement. I looked between them, sensing there was a whole lot of history packed into those few words. Whatever happened between them, it hadn't ended well. Tony straightened. Look, I get it. You don't owe me anything. But if you ever want to throw a little karma into the universe, now's the time. Alex tilted his head. Karma? Tony glanced at me, then back at him. I need access to an old domain registrar account. It's locked because my payment info's dead, and I don't have an ID. But you have connections. Alex was quiet for a long moment. Then he let out a low chuckle. Unbelievable. You vanished for years, resurfaced out of nowhere, and now you're asking me to pull strings. Tony didn't flinch. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. Alex stared at him for another long moment, then sighed. You really haven't changed, have you? Tony gave a small, bitter smile. More than you think. Alex tapped his fingers on the table, thinking. You're lucky I know a guy, and you're even luckier I'm in a good mood today. I perked up. You can actually help? Alex nodded slowly. Maybe. I know someone who works high up in the company that handles domain registrations. If they pull some strings, they might be able to fast-track the ID verification process. No guarantees, but it's better than you two try and fight through a brick wall. Tony sat back, exhaling. If this works, I owe you. Alex smirked again. Damn right you do. And trust me, I'll make sure you pay up. The mood lightened just slightly, but I could still feel the weight of whatever had happened between them hanging in the air. This wasn't just an old friend helping out. This was a guy who still had a few scores to settle. I had no idea what that meant for Tony, but I knew one thing for sure. The game had just changed. A few days passed, and somehow, Tony had gone from a stranger in the parking lot to a full-time guest in my apartment. It was weird, but not in a bad way. He wasn't the kind of guy who made himself a burden. If anything, he kept himself most of the time, helping out where he could, dishes, groceries, even fixing my busted coffee maker like it was some $1 million piece of machinery. We settled into a routine. Mornings started with coffee, mostly in silence, both of us waking up at our own pace. Afternoons were spent making calls, sending emails, following up with Alex's contacts. Nights? Those were for what Tony called catching up on civilization, which mostly meant binge-watching whatever nonsense was trending while he muttered sarcastic commentary under his breath. One night, while I was scrolling through my phone, Tony let out a low whistle from the kitchen. Hey, man, I don't say this often, but I owe you. Like, really owe you. I waved him off. You don't owe me anything. You'd do the same if the roles were reversed. He smirked. That's a bold assumption. But he meant it. I could tell. And honestly, it felt good to see him looking like a person again instead of some ghost wandering through life. Then came the moment we had been waiting for. Alex's contact had worked some magic, and Tony finally got access back to his old account. I wasn't expecting fireworks or dramatic music, but the moment he entered that final password and the screen loaded, it felt like we were cracking open a time capsule. Years of old emails, notifications, and most importantly, messages from companies that had been trying to reach him. At first, he just stared at the inbox, scrolling through endless unread messages. Then his face changed. His posture stiffened, his fingers tightening on the mouse. I leaned over. What? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he clicked on one email, then another, Then another. I saw the subject lines before he even opened them. Regarding domain acquisition. Urgent offer for purchase. Follow-up, high-value asset inquiry. Then he opened the one that made my stomach drop. $3.5 million offer for domain rights. $3.5 million. The email was from a massive corporation. One of those tech giants whose name was plastered on every gadget in every house across the country. They had been trying to reach him for months, maybe even years. They weren't just interested. They were desperate. Tony sat back, exhaling slowly. Holy. Yeah. Neither of us spoke for a while. It wasn't just money. It was life-changing money. Tony ran a hand through his hair, his expression unreadable. They'd been sitting on this offer for how long? I glanced at the timestamps. At least 6 months. He let out a low chuckle, but it wasn't amusement. It was something closer to disbelief. I was out there digging through trash cans while $3 million was waiting for me in my inbox. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. This wasn't just a win. This was a complete reset button on his life. The deal didn't happen overnight. Negotiations, lawyers, contracts, it all took time. But the number didn't change. $3.5 million. And this time, Tony wasn't a guy on the outside looking in. He had control. He had something they wanted. And for the first time in years, he wasn't the one begging for a break. Watching it unfold was surreal. A week ago, Tony was just a guy scraping by. Now, he was sitting at my kitchen table, signing paperwork that would put more money in his account than most people would see in a lifetime. When it was finally done, when the ink was dry and the wire transfer was confirmed, Tony just sat there staring at the confirmation email. No big reaction. No cheering. Just silence. I nudged him. You good? He let out a slow breath and nodded. Yeah, just processing. I got that. It wasn't every day you went from having nothing to having everything. Then he did something I didn't expect. He turned to me and slid his laptop over. Check your account. I frowned. What? Check it. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and almost dropped it. $1,500,000. I blinked, refreshed the screen. Still there. Dude, what the? Tony smirked. Consider it back pay. I shook my head, still trying to wrap my brain around it. I can't take this. You can and you will, he said. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. I let out a stunned laugh. I bought you coffee and a pizza, man. That's not worth $1.5 million. Maybe not, but everything after that? Yeah, it is. I sat back, exhaling. This was insane. A month ago, I was a guy working a dead-end job, barely making rent. Now, I had more money than I knew what to do with. And Tony? He had his life back. And we weren't done yet. Tony tapped his fingers on the table. You ever thought about doing something bigger? I raised an eyebrow. Bigger than managing a supermarket? Not really. Maybe you should start. That's how it began. A simple idea. We didn't just take the money and run. We put it into something real. Something we could build together. A few months later, we opened the doors to our own business. A tech startup, but not the kind that just chased the next trend. Tony had ideas. I had the drive. And together, we made it work. The best part? It wasn't just about the money. It was about proving something. To ourselves, to the people who doubted us, to the ones who thought fate was set in stone. Looking back, it's crazy how everything played out. If I hadn't stopped that night, if I hadn't handed over a cup of coffee and a cheap pizza, none of this would have happened. And that's the thing. You never know how one small choice might change everything. How one act of kindness might set something bigger in motion. People always say you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. But I'd take it further. You never know when the guy standing in front of you, the one who looks like he's got nothing left, might actually be someone with a future worth betting on. I'm just glad I made that bet.